So I'd like to thank you for joining us today for our Grief Sensitivity and Virtual Learning Series Institute. This is session 3. Our website is there, so please look at our website so that you can get the resources. My name is PJ Wanger, and I am the Senior Training Consultation and Specialist School Mental Health Lead for Region 2, MHTTC, Northeast and Caribbean. I am pleased to introduce this session. And I'm going to let Ken talk to us about research-based interventions in grief. The title of our session, I want to thank Ken, I want to thank Dr. Doko for being here with us today, and a big thanks to all of you joining us. We truly hope you find today's presentation engaging and helpful for your work. Next slide, please. So just some housekeeping items. We are recording the presentation. The presentation will be available on our website. If you have questions for our presenter, please put it in the Q&A. If you have comments or you want to send links to any of our attendees, please use the chat box. Make your chat to all attendees and panelists so that everyone sees it. After the presentation, there will be a brief survey. Please complete the survey. It is how we track the information that we present and also how we steer our next trainings. You will receive an email with a certificate to how to access your certificate of attendance. We are closed caption, so you can follow us on closed caption, and please follow us on social media. We have Facebook and Twitter. Next slide, please. So additional grief information resources. These are the resources that you will find on our webpage. They are all about fact sheets about grief, topics that are listed there. We also have a responding to COVID-19 page. So lots of information. Please access this at your leisure after the conference. Next slide, please. So again, we are dealing with sensitive topics here, the idea of grief and loss and our reactions to some of the information that is being presented at the Learning Institute. So we encourage you to take breaks, take care of yourself, get up, move your body, stretch and hydrate, drink lots of water. And we've offered helplines in case you or someone you know is struggling so that you can help them. So please take a snapshot of this and keep it handy for you in case you need it in the future. Next slide, please. So the MHTTC network is offered through SAMHSA, and our charge is to accelerate the adoption and implementation of mental health related evidence-based practices across the nation. These are some of the things that we do. We do have MHTTC networks all across the United States, and that is our link to our website, so please check us out. Next slide, please. This is our wonderful map displaying the centers that make up the MHTTC network. We have 10 regional centers across the United States, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. Please visit our website and find your center so you may stay up to date on our trainings and our resources that are offered in your region as well as across the United States. Next slide, please. This is our disclaimer. The presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in the presentation are the views of our speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. Next slide, please. So I'd like to introduce our speaker today, and I could give you a really long introduction, but I'm going to give you as brief as I can so that we can get on to what Dr. Doka has to say. Dr. Doka is a professor emeritus at the College of New Rochelle and senior consultant to the Hospice Foundation of America, as well as an ordained Lutheran minister. A prolific author, Dr. Doka has written multiple books related to grief, loss, death, and dying. In addition to these texts, he has published over 100 articles and book chapters. Dr. Doka is editor of both Omega, the Journal of Death and Dying and Journeys, a newsletter to help in bereavement. He has an ongoing blog for Psychology Today entitled Good Morning. Dr. Doka was elected president of the Association for Death Education and Counseling in 1993. In 1995, he was elected to the board of directors of the International Work Group on Dying, Death, and Bereavement and served chair from 1997 to 1999. The Association for Death Education and Counseling presented him with an award for outstanding contributions in the field of death education in 1998 and significant contributions to the field of thanatology in 2014. There are many more awards that Dr. Doka has received, and I don't want to name them all because I want Dr. Doka to have plenty of time to present his materials. So without further ado, I'm going to pass off to Dr. Doka. Welcome, Dr. Doka. We are so pleased to have you back with us.
Thank you, and I'm so glad to be back. And I'm going to start by just giving a brief review of some of the things we talked about last month, where we just tried to explain what grief was. And I'm going to do this very, very quickly. And one of the things that I think I want to point out is that grief can be manifested in many ways. We often look at the emotions of grief, and certainly grief affects us emotionally with all kinds of different emotions, running the gamut, really, from anger to sadness to loneliness to yearning, sometimes to senses of relief when somebody dies after a long illness or a long caregiving experience, almost any emotions. It also affects us physically. One of the things we do have to be aware of is that especially in older persons and especially in older widows, it really does affect mortality. It affects us cognitively. It impairs our thinking process sometimes. It affects us spiritually, and it affects us behaviorally. We also pointed out that grief is a very individual reaction. We've moved from the notion of preordained stages of grief to recognizing the very individual pathways that people travel on their journey through grief. And as you assess grief, we pointed out that you have to keep in mind a number of different things that make grief so individual. First of all, the nature of the relationship. What kind of relationship are we talking about? A spouse, a child, a parent, a good friend? Earlier on in the field, we did research trying to see, well, what's the worst loss? And the answer really was the worst loss is the one you're dealing with. That, we can't really rank these in one is harder than the other. We have to look at the nature of the attachment. And again, highly ambivalent attachments often lead to complicated grief. We have to look at the circumstances of the loss. Sudden and unexpected losses are more likely to complicate grief, violent losses. We have to look at the personality and history of the individual, particularly their mental health history. And again, prior issues of anxiety or depression are likely to trigger similar responses after a significant loss. We have to look at family and social support. And we have to look at culture and spirituality. And while I would not ask this question in this way, the question we want to be able to answer for ourselves is essentially, what do I need to know about your culture and your spirituality to work with you effectively? So we might ask about their family background, about some of the things they value, as a way of being able to answer that question. We also have to look at concurrent stresses. What else is going on in their life? Think of, let's say, somebody who loses someone someone dies in a house fire. They may have all kinds of different kinds of issues that they have to deal with. And then, of course, we have to look at health and coping abilities. Again, if your physical health is good, it's easier to cope with other issues. Some of the more modern theories of grief are what's called the dual process model from Strobe and Should. And basically what they're saying is that basically we have to oscillate and move between these. So, we have to deal with the loss, and we also have to deal with how the life changes that occur as a result of the loss. Quick example of that is one time I met a widow. I was counseling a widow, and the widow came in very proud and very happy. And she said, for the first time since my husband died, I was able to balance the checkbook. And then the next week when she came in, she said, if Tom hadn't died, I wouldn't have even had to worry about that. So we oscillate, we move between these two processes, and that's very healthy. If we get stuck in one of them, it can lead to chronic grief. In the other, it could lead to inhibited grief. So if, the oscillation, the movement between these two things is in fact what's very healthy. And that's why when I talk about grief to people, I often talk and use the metaphor of a roller coaster. as one that they can, that you're going to have good days and bad days, much like that widow, days that you're proud of yourself for learning a new skill, and days when you realize that if somebody hadn't died, you wouldn't even have to worry about this. Whenever you're using metaphors with people, you always have to be careful and make sure that it's a metaphor that makes sense to them. So whenever this is a common metaphor I use in counseling, but I always ask a person, have you ever ridden roller coasters? If a person says, I used to ride them all the time when I was a kid, I'll say, well, you're going to be on a roller coaster now. But if a person says, no, I was terrified of them, you don't want to say, well, you're on one now. So then you might use another metaphor like a journey or, depending on their reactions. I like to use the term amelioration, and that means over time, the intensity of grief reactions diminishes. Often people say, yeah, I still have my low days, my bad days, but they don't come as often, they don't last as long, they're not as intense. Individuals function as well as they did, and sometimes better than they did prior to the loss. But grief always has a developmental effect. And that's what that means is that even years later, you can have a grief reaction to an event that happened many, many years ago. It may be the young woman who's walking down the aisle who lost her father maybe 10 years ago when she was a young girl. And as she looks at her side and sees her brother or her uncle or a stepfather or a grandfather with her, she all of a sudden acknowledges that even though he died 10 years ago, she really would have liked her father to be with her. We also have to realize that, one of the comments, and yesterday I even did a presentation on this virtually to the Mayo Clinic, is that COVID really is highly complicating. And I've said that the pandemic of COVID will be followed by a pandemic of complicated grief. And that's because there are restrictions on visiting the ill, so people often don't have a chance to visit or to finish their business. There are ritual restrictions, which again limit the value of funeral rituals. People are experiencing all kinds of multiple losses, including the loss of an assumptive world, the belief that the world is safe, predictable, and benevolent. And even non-COVID deaths can be disenfranchised. My aunt died at 98 years old, surrounded by family and friends on September 12, 2001. And I remember that as I mentioned to people I was going to a funeral, there was this almost note of excitement, and people said, oh, did she die in 9/11? And when you said no, there was almost a sense of disappointment. And even the clergyman who gave her funeral started out by saying, this is not one of those tragic deaths. And family jokes that I rebutted him at the wakeside when I said, for us, this is a traumatic death. This was our aunt. So the question we want to focus on today is how can we counsel individuals struggling with loss? And of course, like anything else, the first thing you have to do is you have to monitor countertransference. To Freud, countertransference was always to be avoided. And now most people understand that, that again, as human beings, when we work with clients and work with patients, we're going to have feelings toward them. It's natural, inevitable, and appropriate. There are clients we like to have come see us, and there are clients that we grit our teeth and maybe are not as happy to see. But the point that is being made now is that we need to understand our feelings toward the client so it doesn't cloud the therapeutic process. And again, countertransference is likely to be higher the longer the length of contact with the client, when the client's characteristics are similar to ours, when therapists and clients share similar experiences or a similar loss. And again, they can be expressed in a number of ways. Projective identification is a form of countertransference where we mirror the client's feelings. They feel hopeless, they rage at their fate, and we kind of do as well. And then objective countertransference, this is what we just talked about, is the normal responses. It's natural, of course, to respond negatively to a hateful client. Obviously, we're going to have sympathy for a dying child, but the dangerous kind of countertransference is what we call subjective countertransference. And this is where the counselor, the client's issues evoke some personal business with the client. And that we have to be always aware of and the like. A number of years ago, I was supervising a social worker who was struggling. He had left his mother in Italy, and he was working with foster children. And whenever he would talk to these foster children, he'd ask when the last time they had contact with their mother, and almost berate them if they hadn't spoken to their mother in a while. And he had to realize that was his issue. He felt he abandoned his mother. A lot of these kids didn't. And again, countertransference can be very upsetting, raw, or they can be outside of awareness. And one of the things we want to recognize is there have been a lot of studies that have talked about what works in therapy. And the answer is everything to some degree. Theory and techniques, the expectancy, the notion that I'm going into therapy, so I'm going to get better, the therapeutic relationships, things that happen outside. And the point we want to make is that the most effective therapists, the most effective counselors are eclectic in the use of theory and techniques. I always, when I taught my students, counseling students, I always used to say, look at the theories, look at the interventions as toolboxes. Not everyone needs the same, not every situation needs the same tool. Also, effective counseling uses the principle of NATO. And what I mean by that is you're not attached to outcome. It's what the client thinks they should be doing. A number of years ago, when I started my grief class, I always start with a case study of in our book that talked about a person who a family that was coming in. The husband and wife were arguing about their son had died and what they should do with the room. The husband wanted to let another child into the room. The mother wanted to preserve the room as almost a museum to her deceased child. And, when I asked students to gather into small groups, this is almost the opening exercise, and to say, what would make you feel good? Just don't talk about the dynamics, don't talk about the interventions, just what outcome would you feel happy with? And and they often tried to solve the problem. The room should be changed. A small section of the room should remain the same. And then I would joke with them and saying, well, some of you it's first day of class, you may be in the wrong program. Some of you are into redecorating, you might want to take that course. And some of you are into real estate. Some people said they should move, should take the real estate course. But the point I was trying to make is you've done your job. If they leave that room with you at the end of therapy with a solution that they're happy with and that they can all live with. And of course, grief counseling is built on basic counseling skills, trust and rapport building, the counseling contract, a good assessment of the manifestations that they're experiencing and the process that they're going through of grief, goals. And again, one of the things we want to acknowledge, which we said in the last session, is that everybody maintains a continuing bond. That's one of the ways our theories have changed in the last 100 years. We don't detach. We don't move on. We stay connected with the person. They're part of our memory. They're part of our biography. They influence us. They've left us their legacies and liabilities. So we want to make sure that, that we know that it's not about detachment. It's not about moving on. It's journeying with. And of course, we want to use good methods and models, and we'll talk about those. And of course, eventually we've got to build an effective termination. And again, if you're going to do grief counseling, always it's important for the client to initiate contact. It's important that the therapist has knowledge about grief. And again, what I see sometimes is clients who are, therapists who are stuck with models that are no longer acceptable, like the stage model of grief. That was a model that was presented 50 years ago. Kubler-Ross did a wonderful job in bringing that to her attention. Actually, her model was about coping with dying rather than grief. But again, in 50 years, our theories and our methods have changed. Should have a sensitivity to the many losses that people talk about, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And of course, the heart of grief counseling is validation, that we validate those losses for people. And again, one of the things we want to realize is that people with a secure attachment rather than an ambivalent attachment usually do better in grief. So sometimes we can use our own attachment with the client who's having attachment issues that complicate grief as a way of reminding them that they are worthy and worthwhile, and can move into better situations. I always say there's no silver bullet. There's no set protocol or approach. There's nothing that works all the time. So, the individualized nature of grief requires individualized treatment. Be eclectic, be prescriptive. And what I mean by prescriptive, know what you're doing and prescribe it. We're going to talk about bibliotherapy in a while. And, you don't just say pick up a book, but you prescribe a book as carefully as you would a medicine. And of course, when I train my therapists, I always say, you got to experiment and you got to be based on the evidence. I always like to use what I call the rule of three, that when you offer suggestions to clients, it's always good to give 3 suggestions. 1 means do this. You're having unfinished business with the client, write him a letter. 2 means do this or that, write him a letter or speak to an empty chair. And by giving them more than 2, saying some people do this and some people do that, and some people do something else, and maybe others do this, it allows them to make their own choices. Again, metaphors are important in counseling, and explore the counselor's metaphors of grief. For example, if a client says, I guess grief is a journey, I just read a book about that. And you'd say, okay, well, where do you rest? And when you're on a journey, you need times to relax. You can't journey day after day after day. Are your family members in the same place in this journey? Where do you want to go? And how do you hope to get there? Again, one of the things that's very valuable in grief is psychoeducation. And what that means is that sometimes people just need information. Probably more than a half of my clients I can do very brief therapy with, because they're really experiencing typical grief and just don't get it, So as soon as you educate them about what's valuable, maybe assign some bibliotherapy, assign a book that they might read, they feel very validated and very normal. Lots of times, when I do public speaking to groups of bereaved, often the question is, am I going crazy? And most of the time, the answer is no. You're just grieving. So I might have a client who say it's 6 months later, and I'm still crying, and that would be normal. That would be natural. So again, psychoeducation is an important aspect of grief counseling. But one of the things I'm going to stress, and I'm going to use a model with you today, is that models can be valuable, but models aren't reality. Models are a way to help the clients understand reality, and they're useful insofar as they help you or insofar as they help the client. The model that we're going to use is called the task model, and I'm going to show you the work and share with you the work of J. William Worden. And one of my mentors, Charles Corr, has talked about the value of that model. And he acknowledges that, that the task model simply says there are certain things that bereaved people have to accomplish and have to do, and that they face their own issues in their own way. And these tasks are nonlinear, and they stress individual autonomy. People choose the task that they want to choose. And the counselor really is just helping them do their task work. So Bill Worden talks about what he calls the tasks of grief. And I've modified Worden's work here for 2 reasons. One is I've added a 5th task or another task to his task, which is the last one there. And number 2, Where Bill Warden would say, acknowledge the reality of death, I would say, acknowledge the loss, because we grieve lots of things that aren't deaths. We grieve all kinds of things. People get divorced and they go through a process of grief. So again, I've tried to make these more global. It's interesting, by the way, probably when I talked about the study of grief being 100 years old, I'm really referring to perhaps the first psychological study of grief, first psychological article that was ever published on grief recently, or in the last century, that really marked the beginning of the scientific study of grief. And it was an article by Freud. And Freud always started with a case study. And his case study there was not what you'd expect. It wasn't a widow or a widower. It wasn't a bereaved child or a bereaved parent. It was a bride abandoned at the altar. And I think Freud was trying to remind us, grief is about loss. That certainly is a very significant loss, but not the only loss we grieve. And again, I've added that fifth task on spirituality because I think it's very, very critical and very important. Warden, who's a good friend, disagrees with me, and he says it's just part of adjusting to life, responding to some of the criticisms that a number of us have given it. But I like to think of it as a very distinct issue. So how do we use a task model? Well, we ask the question, what tasks is the person struggling with? What are some barriers to them? Why are they struggling with that task? And then we can structure interventions. And again, one of the things I like about Warden's tasks is it reminds us grief is not just about emotion. It's about adjusting to life. It's about how to maintain a continuing bond. It's about cognitively accepting the reality. And I kind of use, Warden's model, even when I'm evaluating, for instance, grief groups, curricula for grief groups and grief education. Are they just dealing, today we're going to deal with anger, tomorrow we're going to deal with guilt? Or are they dealing with, how do you adjust to life? How do you relearn how to live, using a phrase by Tom Attic? If you've eaten with somebody for 50 years, slept with somebody for 50 years, how do you learn to eat and sleep alone? Those are significant issues. So let's look at these in tasks. And let me tell you the structure I'm using here. I'm going to talk about a task. And as I talk about the task, I'm going to talk about the things that may create barriers, and we'll talk about some interventions. And then I also want to acknowledge, since some of you may be working with children, some of the unique issues that children may have with these tasks. And that'll be the model as we go through these tasks. So again, we need to acknowledge the loss. And morning rituals, however they are, can be very useful. And of course, that's one of the problems with the COVID-19 pandemic is we might not have the rituals that really help. Avoid euphemisms. Number of years, somebody did a study and they found out there were over 600 euphemisms dealing with death and dying. And when I taught class, I used to ask students to talk about all the euphemisms that they know: kicking the bucket, gone to a better place. And all of those sometimes make it harder to acknowledge the loss. By the way, the only thing greater than euphemisms about death was sex, and slightly under it were euphemisms about bathroom behavior. People need to talk about the event. As they talk about the event, it becomes more real. So some of the techniques you can do as a counselor are asking them to recall the story and then noticing what the hot spots are. Where does the client get emotional? And then, kind of have them recount those hotspots a few times until it becomes more part of the story than an interruption to the story. With children, the barriers are that sometimes younger children simply can't understand death. We grow in our understanding of death over time, and most children, by the time they're 8 or 9, have mastered the varied concepts that are part of death, but it does take time. Another barrier for children is adult protectiveness. We again try to cover up death. We try to have children avoid it, and the like. Sometimes our unclear language. Grandma has gone to sleep in the Lord, and now it's time for you to go upstairs and go to sleep. And of course, their limited experience. So some strategies we may use with children are, again, the value of clear communication, open communication, clear language. And, I would tell that to my students, even if you're counseling adults. Don't use terms, use the death language. Where were you when you heard your mother died? Rather than where were you when you heard about it? Supported visits. So with children, it might be good to see grandma in the nursing home if that's possible. And presence at rituals. And sometimes children can just benefit by drawing or acting out events. Again, it's a way to make it more real. Another task is to express manifest and latent feelings. Somebody once described the process of decathexis, which is what we talk about here, as sort of peeling of an onion. Each level has different reactions. And, when you think about a good relationship, you've had it over time. There have been good times and bad times, and you sort of have to peel those levels aside and see how people are reacting. And again, as a counselor, to do that, we want to create a very safe and non-judgmental environment. We want to validate feelings, make people feel safe in expressing those feelings. We want to assess with them emotionally difficult events, whether it's approaching holidays or whether it's clearing out the person's drawers or property, whatever it may be. One of the big factors here is ambivalence. I'm sorry about that. I don't know where it's coming from, to be honest with you. One of the big factors here is ambivalence. And what we mean by ambivalence, sorry, I thought I cut off the phone. One of the big factors with ambivalence is that in many relationships, we have mixed feelings. We love a person, but they drive us crazy. And of course, one of the things we know about grief is the more ambivalent the relationship, the more difficult it is to grieve that relationship. And that's why, for instance, adolescents can struggle sometimes with grief because they have a highly ambivalent relationship about the loss. That's an ambivalent time in our lives, so that's why adolescent losses of parents or even siblings can be very, very difficult. We may have to cope with unfinished business. Maybe there was something that we wished we had said or something we had wished we had done. And of course, in the COVID time, this becomes a very, very big issue when we may not have opportunities to finish that business. One of the big things that people struggle with is guilt. And we could spend a whole hour and a half just on dealing with guilt. And guilt can be multifaceted. But one of the questions that I often find helpful when I'm dealing with clients is simply when they talk about their guilt to ask the question, would others find you guilty? And a lot of times the answer is no. Another thing that happens here is to express what we call extraordinary experiences. And these are the unusual experiences that we have, and many bereaved people have them, about 60% according to studies, where they may feel the presence of somebody or dream of the person or thought they saw the person. And again, I often find that when I ask that question, usually in the way of saying, sometimes people have shared with me unusual experiences like clients have a twofold relationship. Part of them, they're sort of surprised and they often say, I never told anybody this, but, and they'll tell it. And again, one of the questions we might want to ask is, how does your spirituality or your philosophy help you deal with loss or complicate your dealing with loss? And I often use what I call the technique of enlightened ignorance. I don't know much about Judaism, or I don't know much about Catholicism. How do you, what helps you deal with that? And again, we're going to talk a little bit about therapeutic ritual in a little bit, and also expressive approaches. One of the best things that I do with clients sometimes is have them do a pictorial biography of the person. Get out all those pictures when you're ready, put them in a picture book in some order. And it often, as they do that, allows them to uncover all kinds of feelings and reactions. This is another taxology of unfinished business, statements of admiration and value, missed opportunities, and unresolved confessions and disclosures. So again, just another way of looking at this. And again, I love this cartoon. I'm terribly mixed up. And again, Niemeyer, one of my colleagues, suggests that in highly ambivalent relationships, it's worthwhile to split the person, to say, let's look at this person in two separate ways. Person number one, same person, is the good person. What you like about him? And person number two, that's the bad side. That's maybe when the person gets drunk. What don't you like about him? And then finally, people can reconcile these identities. Now, one of the things that sometimes can be important here, especially when you're dealing with emotions and emotions that may be uncomfortable. For example, as we talked about in the last session, people can have great feelings of anger, and they can even feel angry at the deceased for dying, for leaving them. And sometimes it's very useful to use self-disclosure. Now, again, if you're a strict Freudian, that's a no-no. But I've used it a lot in grief counseling, where I've said, sometimes, when my father died, I felt very guilty about this one situation. Have you experienced guilt? And I always joke about what I call my 3 rules. If you are going to self-disclose, keep it brief, keep it goal-oriented, and then ask the question, in other words, why would you be asking that question at this time? Hopefully you have some kind of goal there. And then finally, what I call the morning after effect. And what I mean by the morning after effect is, and this especially counts for school counselors, are you telling people something that that could come back and hurt you? When I was in my counseling programs, we had guidance counselors as students, and sometimes people would make terrible mistakes. They'd say something to a child, look, when I was your age, I smoked marijuana. And of course, those can be career killers in some places. With children, again, the barriers may be that young children have a very short feeling span and a limited vocabulary to explain their feelings. You probably remember the short feeling span of kids. When my son was about 6 years old once, we got into our first really big fight where he was going to run away from home. And it was a Saturday, and I heard him in his room crying and packing his bag. And I was very upset that the conflict had reached that point. And as a counselor, I was feeling I shouldn't have. I could probably have done some better things myself. It's funny how when we're in the counseling field, we always think we can be as objective in our own personal situations. And so as I'm still processing this, about 15 minutes later, he came out, and I was a single dad raising a single child. And we used to do something on Saturday, and all of a sudden he came out from his room, and his tears were dried, and he looked at me, he said, "Are we going ice skating tonight?" And I was still coping with my feelings, and I said, "What's the plan? Are you going to run away and meet me at the rink?" And he thought that was very funny. He had moved on. Children have their feelings are often like brief thunderstorms rather than long rainy days. Parents can again be protective. Adolescents can be defensive. So some of the strategies we might use are there are all kinds of games that help children identify feelings. There's a technique called 5 faces, where you give faces of people who are mad, sad, happy, glad, and I forget what the other one is, but confused. Mad, sad, happy, glad, and confused. And you can make a game out of it. You draw a card and say, well, when was the last time you felt sad, or what made you feel sad about that, and what made you feel mad about that? And again, children work very well with expressive approaches. Again, prescriptively. Some kids like art, some kids like body movement, some kids like other things, storytelling therapies, what have you. Connecting actions and feelings. So, so saying, well, when you felt this way, what did you do? And, and again, helping children to assess self-blame and unrealistic thinking. I once had a situation of a kid who who told his mother once, in anger, I wish I was an orphan. I hope you die. And about 3 weeks later, the mother did die, and the kid was devastated and felt that he had caused his mother's death. And I, kind of talked to him and said, well, you're really not powerful. And I really started pushing him a little bit. And I said, I want you to wish me dead. And I finally got him to the point where he said, I wish you would die dead. And I said, okay. And the next session, he kind of laughed about it, and we were able to say, see, you don't have that power, do you? It would have been hellish if I died. It would have really screwed that kid up. But I don't know. I thought about that at the time. We have to live in a changed world. To warden, it means adjusting to all the external, internal, and spiritual changes. It really is important here to give people choice, to let people say, well, even if those choices are small, it may be as much as saying, I had one mother who, because of their father's death, they had to move out of the house. And again, they moved to a smaller house in the same town. But it was important that the mother gave the kid a choice of which of two houses, but the choices have to be real. Plan for difficult events and times, like the holidays. The holidays are tough when you're grieving. So where are you going to spend them? With whom are you going to spend them? These are all important questions. Assess secondary losses and gains. Secondary losses are the losses that follow a primary loss. I always remember a bereaved parent who said to me, when I lost my son, I didn't realize I would simultaneously lose all of his friends. And that really affected me because, I knew my son's friends and they were part of my life too, in some ways, still are. And again, sometimes the secondary gains. Assess changes, assess coping styles, assess family strengths, even over generations. And it always helps to explore, as you dealt with crises before, what worked well for you and what didn't, and help them problem solve. Again, I always say there are no rules in grief, but if I would make one rule, and remember there are no rules, my one rule would be try as much as possible to avoid radical change. That's, and one of the truisms is grief is try not to make any big moves for about a year, if you can, if it's possible. Because number one, it's additional stress at a time that's already very stressful. Number two, given the cognitive issues in grief, you might not be making the best choices. And number three, you might be isolating yourself from support. And then assess support. And I always use a neat little trick that's really become very popular over the years, and it's called DLR. And that's once I know somebody has a support network, I ask them to list their support network. And then I ask them to put a D next to all the people who are good doers, people you can ask to take in the mail or drive you somewhere. And then I have them put an L next to the people who are good listeners. Sometimes people can be both, but a lot of times they have different strengths. And a lot of times we ask our listeners to do and our doers to listen, and we find ourselves frustrated. And then the third group of people are what I call respite people. These are the people who often drive us crazy because they never want to mention our loss. They're afraid we're going to talk about it. But their value is that they give us time off from our grief. We can go to dinner with them. We can go to a good movie with them. And we never have to worry that they're going to turn and say to us, but how are you really doing? Because they hope against hope that we don't talk about it. But that's their strength. And then analyze and counter and what we call empathic failure. And what that means is if somebody is not getting the support that they need, what factors are creating difficulties in that support? Why aren't they getting that support? And of course, grief is stressful. If you look at most stress scales, it's probably one of the major stressors when you lose somebody important in your life. One stress scale that I sometimes see says, okay, stress of losing a job is 50 points. And if you have over 100 points, then you really are in dangerous ground. And, and sometimes the death of a spouse or the death of a child gives you 100 points automatically. When I work on stress management, I use what I call the ABCs. Assess it, alter it, or if you can't alter it, avoid it, or accept it by building a resistance or changing your perceptions, and possible maybe a D there too. And what I mean by drugs are not illegal drugs, but we may need some anti-anxiety medication sometimes to get us through tough periods. Again, other stress management strategies are breathing, meditation and imaging, spirituality, however we define it for ourselves, assessing, relaxing, and stress reduction approaches that we previously used. And again, just taking good care of ourselves. And it's really important to use that with clients. Another technique that can be used is what I call alternative futures. And I say, think, okay, here you are in the midst of this grief, this loss, and envision possible futures. You want the future same as now, much better or worse? And ask them to describe the future they want, and then plot how they may get there. With children, again, the barriers are they may have a lack of control over changes. They may have to move, much like that young son did, without any control over it. They might not fully understand why they have to do these things. So again, strategies are empower communication between parents and children. Sometimes as a therapist, I'll do that when I'm working with a child. We'll have what we call report back sessions, and that's a good time for me to advocate for the child. Emphasize the value of true choice. This goes back to what I said. If you're intent on buying house A, don't give the child the choice between house A and house B. And then if they choose B, saying, but we really want to choose A. That really disempowers them. But if you're really willing to say, okay, you can choose the room, you can choose the house, you can choose, make sure it's a true choice. Sometimes it helps children to draw life before and after the loss, gives them a sense of their reality. And again, with children, anticipate difficult days. Another technique that I like to use with children is what I call the magic wand. And I actually have, I thought I had a magic wand here. I'll have to get a new magic wand. But I actually used to have that as a therapeutic tool. And it's a way to assess children thinking about their fantasies. So I would say to a child, okay, here's a magic wand. If you had a magic wand, what would you change? And how would that make you and your life different? But the one provision is you can't bring the person back from the dead. Not that magic. But what else could you do? A fourth task is to relocate the deceased. And that means we move on, yet we stay connected. And again, we're always going to be bonded to those people whom we love and who are no longer here. But how are we going to manage those bonds? How will you remember the person? And again, we're going to talk about therapeutic ritual and expressive techniques. Like that photo album might be a good way of doing it. Memory boxes, all of these are nice ways that you stay connected. One of the things that's very important, but has to be done very, very carefully, is what we call benefit finding. And benefit finding is where you ask the person, people who say, there's been some good changes in my life since then. I've learned things, I've grown in certain ways, do better in grief than people who can't say that. But on the other hand, you don't want to be sort of bursting out in song and saying, well, give me the silver lining. What I usually do is when a patient says, gee, for the first time, I balanced the checkbook. And I would say, gee, what other skills have you developed? That's interesting. What other skills have you developed since the death of your spouse? So you want to be really careful on that. I usually wait for the client to give me an opening, but I find that very useful. Another thing that can be really done well here is a variation with the empty chair technique. And I'm going to talk about another variation as well soon. But you might say to the person, you've been grieving now since your husband died 8 months ago, or since your child died 8 months ago. Suppose there was another bereaved mother or another bereaved spouse sitting in this chair. What would you say to them about the journey? What would you want to tell them? And it gives people a chance to get perspective. With children, again, the barriers are the short feeling and attention spans of young children. again, the protectiveness of parents. And if the person died when the child was very young, they may have very fragmentary memories of that person. I have a godson who I'm very close to. He's in his 30s now. We helped raise him, I'm proud to say. And his father died the day before his 4th birthday. And his memories of his father are very, very fragmented. And what are family rules? Can people share memories? Can people talk about those? And again, some strategies may be to create timelines and life histories. Where were you when this happened? Memory books and boxes and things like that. One thing I've learned over time is be very careful if you're dealing with people who are really at the very fragments of society, struggling with, with lower social class, because often they might not be able to preserve and keep a lot of these things. So you always want to be careful about saying, bringing all the pictures, because some kids literally may not have them. Another technique is to draw a picture of someone in my heart forever. And this would be the cover of the card, and inside would be a note to the person. So this was a young boy whose father was killed as a policeman in service, and he talked about how he loved to do things with his father, fish and hunt, and made a note to his dad. The last task is the one, and I shouldn't say the last task. Remember, these tasks are non-linear. The next task is to rebuild faith or philosophical systems challenged by loss. And again, we may have to do a spiritual assessment of the person, and the role of spiritual exploration. How does your beliefs, how does your philosophy, how does your faith speak to you in these situations? And we may have them read certain kinds of books. There's a couple of books that really deal with this particular issue. One of them is Rabbi Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And the other one is C.S. Lewis's book, Grief Observed, among a number of others. The Shack would be a third. And there are a number of books like that. But the important thing is you want to make sure you got the right book for the right person. So you want to be careful about that. And then, anything that helps them involve meaning-making strategies. And what I call A-team referrals. And what I mean by A-team referrals is, if you're a counselor, know the clergy in your community that you can really count on, that can really help you deal with people who are really struggling with spiritual issues and the like. I once was dealing with a very fundamental Christian man who believed that his adolescent son, who died by suicide, was in hell. And I didn't have the spiritual capital, even though I'm a Lutheran minister, because, in his view, I was probably going to join his son in hell at some point in time, since I didn't believe quite what they believed. But I had a student from that religious tradition. And by the way, his own minister had said that at the son's funeral. But I sent him to this clergyman, part of the same denomination, former student of mine, who did something that I would have never thought to do, but worked out wonderfully. He talked about the character Samson in the Old Testament. And if you remember the story of Samson and Delilah, Samson was very self-destructive. He died by suicide, but he was also very self-destructive. He was with this woman, Delilah, if you remember the story, and she'd say, she was the enemy Philistines, and she'd say, well, how do you get rid of your strength? And he said, well, you tie me in 7 knots and 7 ropes. And he finds himself tied one morning when he wakes up in 7 knots and 7 ropes, and just flexes his muscles and breaks them. And at this point, you think he should be thinking, this woman doesn't have my best interest at heart. But he doesn't. And finally, he tells her the secret. Guess what? She shaves his head. He's captured. He's tortured. And then in the end, he brings down the temple and kills the Philistine leadership. But the point he made was that he brought him to a section in the New Testament, where among the faithful is Samson listed as those from the Old Testament in heaven. And it was really a kind of remarkable experience for that person. And we can continue our work. But again, he needed somebody from his own faith tradition for credibility. We also, one of the issues that may rise there is spiritually is the issue of forgiveness. And again, forgiveness is a virtue in most belief systems. And again, it's an issue only if it's an issue for the client. But I often have that where somebody may have been killed by a drunk driver, and the person says, I know I should forgive the person, but I just can't seem to. And there you can use a number of strategies. Forgiveness doesn't mean that the person can't go through the wheels of justice, shouldn't go through the wheels of justice. And forgiveness may involve repentance, and forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, or you can pray for strength to forgive or hold God out to forgive. Again, the point I'm trying to make is don't impose spiritual issues on clients, and help clients deal with those issues. With children, again, the barriers may be they're spiritual pioneers. That's a term that Robert Coles used, which I love, that they're still trying to figure out what their faith is. Adolescents may be spiritually questioning. So again, empower parents and other adults within their tradition to share how their beliefs help them in loss. What are the spiritual stories that make meaning for them? And again, how does this change their view of the world? As you work toward termination, Catherine Sanders, one of my colleagues, used to say 3 questions. You're going into a new life right now. What do you want to take from your old life into your new life? Well, I want to take maybe some happiness back with me. Well, what do you want to leave behind? Well, I want to leave behind maybe some of the guilt. And what do you need to add? And again, some of the things that I do is again, I say, now remember, you've made a lot of progress here. You've learned a lot. You've developed a lot. But remember what we talked about, that roller coaster. There are going to be surges of grief, maybe later on. And what might those be? Maybe when the first grandchild is born. And then sometimes I like to ask, I even do this in a support group, if I meet you in a year and I say, gee, it's been a year, what's gone on? What are you going to tell me? It allows you to assess whether they're still hopeful. And again, utilize innovative and eclectic approaches. Self-help books can be very useful. This is one that I wrote, but there are lots of them out there, because self-help books provide a sense of validation. They, as you read them, you find, what you're experiencing is normal. I once was dealing with a young 13-year-old client whose mother had died. And I finally assigned him a book. We were just not making progress with his guilt. And, he was an adolescent. He had some arguments with his mother. And I gave him a book, When Your Parent Dies. And I asked him to read it for me and come back the next section. And when he came back, he was so excited about the book. And I said, well, what did you gain from it? And he said, well, that everyone feels guilty, and that being guilty is a natural kind of response that a lot of kids have and a lot of people have. And I said, yeah, but we've been talking about that for the last 4 sessions. And he said, yeah, but you're a nice guy. And when you see it in print, it's different. So again, learn coping techniques. It helps people learn coping techniques. It provides hope, and bibliotherapy can be a really good intervention, especially with people who just need to have a sense that they're going through a very typical process, that there's, that again, they're struggling not with unusual, highly ambivalent, highly complicated losses, but they're just unaware of the process of grief. Charles Corr gives guidelines. Read and evaluate the book. In other words, don't just say pick a book, but prescribe a book just as you would prescribe medication, very carefully. This book for this reason. Select appropriate titles for capability and context. Cope with any limitations of the book. One of the good books that I've sometimes given to storybooks, sort of for young children, is My Grandpa Died Today. The book is very good at validating feelings, but the ending's a little bit too sunny for me. He comes out, he just comes back from his grandpa's funeral. He's had a great relationship with his grandfather. He's grieving his grandfather's death. His friends come and say, why don't you come outside and play baseball? And he's encouraged by his parents to do so. He hits a grand slam home run. And he feels great about life again. And when I work with children, I'll have them read the book, and I'll say, "Do you think the boy really was okay after that, or do you think he had some tough times later on?" And we talked about that kind of roller coaster. So discuss the book with the client, whether the client is 90 or 9 or 6. And again, I just have some, there are a couple of resources here, a couple of places that really offer lots of resources centered on death. One of them is the Centering Corporation outside of Nebraska and the Compassion Book Service in North Carolina. They specialize in books dealing with grief and loss. One of my favorite cartoons, Sorry, No Water, we're just a support group. Now, in truth, support groups are very valuable for a lot of the same reasons. They provide opportunities for validation. You realize you're not acting in an unusual way. They give opportunities for ventilation. They provide respite and support. You learn coping techniques. You see people at different phases in the bereavement process, and that gives you hope. And then, helping others is therapeutic. That's part of the benefit finding of it. So you really can learn from other people. Now, support groups, though, need certain things. And some of the research really says, that while being in a good support group can be very helpful, being in a bad support group may really become problematic. So, you want to know that, that people in a support group need a sense of inclusion. The person fits in with it, that the person has a sense of some control, that his or her opinions, their story matter, and they need to feel liked. And again, if you're choosing to start a support group, ask yourself the question, first of all, do we need it? What's available? What's around? Where would my group fit in? What would make it different from the other groups that are around? Will it be open-ended or close-ended? An open-ended group just meets maybe every second Thursday of the month, or every second and first and third Thursday of the month, and people come in when they want to and they leave when they want to. A closed group, maybe you commit to 8 sessions and you're expected to go to all those 8 sessions. Is it self-help, meaning that it's mostly bereaved people, maybe with a trained facilitator, or is it a therapeutic group? Maybe running with a psychologist or a counselor running it. How many sessions? Can people recycle if it's a closed-ended group? In other words, if they want to go to the next session of 8 sessions, can they do so? You should have an intake process to screen people, to make sure people are capable of sharing and capable of listening. Some people are so compelled by their stories, they just want to tell it. They don't want to listen necessarily to other people. And then, you need to set rules about confidentiality and the like. One of the rules that I set with my group is that, that if I meet them on the outside, I won't recognize them. And I say the same thing to my clients, unless they recognize me first. That's not a snobby thing. I just don't want to come up to somebody and say, "Hey, Joe, how you doing?" And then the person who says, "Who the hell is that?" And the person says, "Oh, it's my therapist. You're in therapy." So I do this to protect their privacy. But if they come up to me and say, "Hey, Dr. Doka, I'd like you to meet my brother," or something like that, I'm more than happy to engage. And again, the danger of support groups is that what we call shared anguish. That that all of a sudden people seem to try to top each other off in terms of the story. In other words, if you think your story is bad, wait till you hear my story, and the group just becomes a crying session. That's why you need an intake process, and that's why groups shouldn't just be the expression of emotions, but they should have a wider curricular, a wider subject matter, somewhat based on the kinds of things that Warden and Strobe and Schutz said, the different issues that you struggle with in bereavement. And of course, they should have a facilitator who says, okay, a lot of you have expressed your anger at this, in your loss, but what are some of the ways we can cope with it? what are some of the effective ways that you've dealt with that anger? So you're sharing not just problems, but you're sharing coping strategies. Very, very critical. Again, some of the questions to ask: can a group respect the different types of loss? Or are people going to try to do upmanship? It's worse to lose a child. That's the worst loss. All losses are bad. I always like what Earl Groman says: the worst loss is the one that you are experiencing. Sharing what helped me rather than would work for you. Again, that's another thing you have to stress with the group. It's not you should, but when I felt guilt, it helped me to talk to this or to do that. Not saying that it'll help you. Emphasis on not just sharing problems, which we talked about earlier, but ways to cope, and using our model again, and respecting the fact that some people are going to grieve in a much more emotional way, and other people are going to grieve in a much more active way, doing their grief, so to speak. And then what are some of the issues and problems you may experience in the group? Again, having opportunities to talk with, how do you deal with a member who won't shut up? Or other kinds of things. And again, there are other group modalities we can use as well, that aren't just support groups. A number of years ago, there was a mine explosion in Idaho, in the panhandle of Idaho. And when they, and again, this is, very rugged area, lots of hunting, lots of fishing, beautiful area for that. And when they talk with the kids, they did a needs assessment in the school, and especially a lot of the young boys said, what we miss about our dads, and mostly exclusively dads died in the mine, is that we used to go camping and stuff with them. So they created a group to do that. And what they found is that even though it wasn't quote unquote a grief group, as these boys gathered around a campfire at night, they often reminisced about their dad, and they found it was very, very therapeutic. Other groups may be discussion and reading groups, or educational seminars. I used to offer two seminars a year. One of them would be offering right about now, called How to Handle the Holidays. And again, my support group would come to it, but lots of other people who weren't in the support group would come to it. And I think my support group mostly came to support me. Informal groups. Again, in Idaho, this one hospice brought a group of men together, and they asked the men, you don't come to grief groups, but what can we do for you? This was a hospice grief program. And they said, well, this is Idaho, and men do men's things and women do women's things. And we don't have a clue as to how to do laundry or how to work in the kitchen. And so they met at the high school home ec lab, and they learned about, cleaning and doing all of these kinds of things. And they liked it so much. They said, it's nice to know how to cook, but I want to know how to cook my wife's recipe. And so they ended up coming into a group that would cook together their wives' meals. And it really worked out well. Problem solving groups, expressive art groups, all of these can be other modalities that can be very, very useful. And again, expressive approaches can be very, very useful. They're a bridge to culture and spirituality. They're natural if you're, especially with children, but not just with children. If you're drawing, that's a natural thing to do. Sitting around with an adult one-on-one is not so much natural. They're reflective. You can say, why did you draw that way? They're cathartic. If you're drawing hard and it's a way to get out anger, and they're projective. People will tell you things in their drawings that they're not even aware of in themselves. And again, you could do all kinds of things: art, photo projects, memory boxes and books, memorial songs, feeling masks. Feeling mask is, you could do it with paper mache, or you could do it in different kinds of ways, one of the ones that I like is a mask that has an inside and an outside, and the mask on the outside is what I'm showing to the world, but the mask on the inside is what I'm really feeling. When you're working with children, Nancy Boyd Webb reminds us that, again, play is very important. And again, for some of the same reasons. And be prescriptive and intentional. And what I mean by prescriptive is always really kind of be aware of of what the child is trying to, or what the person is trying to, is good at or not good at. When I was, my right side is my dominant side. When I was 5 years old, I broke my arm, my right arm, very, very badly. I now write left-handed. I was never good at art, and I never liked art for that reason. But I would have been done great with clay or storytelling therapy. So again, you have to find the right approach with the right child. Another wonderful strategy is interviewing the internalized other. Again, it's a kind of thing that goes on with an empty chair, but it's again a variation of that. And what you do here is you say to the person, okay, the person speaks to an empty chair, and then they get on the other side of the chair and speak as they think the person would speak to them. And I had a wonderful example of that with a 13-year-old client who felt very guilty about his dad. His dad died, and the last day his dad was alive, he was anxious to get, he was anxious to get out of the hospital. He had a ball game to go to, and he was trying to push his mother out, didn't realizing his father was at the brink of death, and nobody in the family did at that point in time. And the father said, called him back, said, give me a last time. He said, can't, Dad, tonight. And of course, the father died that night. He felt very, very guilty. And finally, I had him look at the chair and tell the chair about that night. He was sobbing and crying. And then I said, I want you to sit in the chair. This is still a hard story to tell. He said, I want you to sit in the chair and answer as your dad would answer. And he sat in the chair and he said, is that what's bothering you, champ? And he started laughing. He said, that's exactly what my father would say. So again, it can be a very therapeutic, very powerful tool. Another one is if a person believes in heaven, it can be, and again, it can be a thing where they go and finish business or reinforce connections. Again, it can reduce trauma. It can emphasize the continuing bond. It builds resistance. It's a good technique. And again, just to talk about resilience, some of the things that really help resilience, especially for children, is stable and supportive homes, an authoritative family parenting style. The parents are involved in education. Again, families that have more resources are usually better off. Families that have some kind of affiliation with some kind of faith or some kind of philosophy, and a positive family relationship, parental confidence, extended family. These all are resilient builders, and they're community resilient builders. Again, people are more resilient in communities where they have safe and resourceful, where they have good supportive schools and accessible services. And again, some of the ways to teach that to children are what I call rock solid support. I have them glue rocks on a page with them in the center, and then talk about who's in their support system. So they name the rocks. And and again, we can talk about who you can listen to, who's good to hang out with when you don't want to talk about your grief, all those kinds of things. Another technique is give yourself a hand. You trace one hand and you write your internal strengths, and on the other hand, you talk about your external strengths. Another technique is shields and first aid kits. What helps you get through your grief? What are the people, the activities, the resources? All ways to help kids get strength-based approaches. A mountain of strength. Each week they add new discoveries about strength in the mountain, 2 pieces of paper. And they suggest a celebration with the parents, maybe just going out for an ice cream sundae or dinner at McDonald's or some other place once the mountain is full. The trick is, when you're working with children's grief, you want to empower families. Children's grief takes place in a family context. You want to understand their rules and communication. And again, the biggest risk factor for children is children will generally do well, have positive outcomes if their parents are functioning well. If they're not, then you want to try to reach into the extended family and intimate networks to find those people who can help. Funerals can be valuable. Again, I want to get to questions. I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly. They are psychologically, they confirm the reality. They allow doing. They allow memories and feelings to be shared. They provide social support and community. And again, they interpret the death. Funerals are more ritual, more meaningful when they're personalized, when the child or adult or anybody has a role, when you sort of translate them, when you deal with multiple identities. And again, in funerals, you have to both, there's a dual process too. And I'm a little scared about what's now in the funeral industry of celebrating lives rather than mourning deaths. You need to do both. You need to have that dual process. You need to acknowledge grief and say and acknowledge the legacies. And sometimes you can create therapeutic ritual, and that's using ritual as a therapeutic tool. There's a powerful word about ritual. It's called liminal. It means it takes place on the bridge between consciousness and unconsciousness. And also it's a bridge to culture and spirituality. So again, rituals may be rituals of continuity that just say there's always a bond. When we decorate our Christmas tree every year, the first 3 ornaments we put on are rituals are memorial ornaments to my father, my mother, and my godson's father. Rituals of transition are rituals that mark unmoving. I had one powerful ritual of transition where a woman came up before her church and she wanted to take off her wedding ring, and the priest asked her her vows, and she answered in the past tense. Asked her vows, and she answered in the past tense. Were you faithful? And he said, "May I have the ring, please?" And that was a beautiful ritual. And sometimes you can have rituals of reconciliation where you just say, "I'm sorry." And sometimes you can just have rituals that affirm that person. With my godson, one of the rituals of affirmation that we did is I met his father through a delinquency prevention program. Before I got involved in this field, I was involved in the field of delinquency prevention. And his father was quite a character, to put it mildly. And it was kind of a 70s program. I always describe it as a classic 70s program. Little supervision, little input, just do your thing and everything will work out fine, which happily in this case it sort of did. But we were encouraged to take the kids on activities, and I would take his father fishing. And one time, that's better, I think. I finally figured out how to do that. In any case, one time in this ritual of reconciliation, this ritual of affirmation, so one time anyway, sorry, that distracted me, as I'm sure it distracted you, and I do apologize. The one thing that we did learn and did say, what, I'm sorry, let me get back. So we used to take him fishing, and he liked it, loved going out in the country. He was a city kid, and he would always, for example, lose lures. And no matter how much you told him to try to, he just pull it till it broke. And so one time I opened up my tackle box, and he gave me about a dozen new lures. And I looked at him and I said, "Michael, are these hot?" And he looked at me, and he was about 10, had a very innocent look. He said, "I would tell you if they were hot." And I apologized. And about 5 years later, as he opened the tackle box, he said, "Oh, you still have the hot lures." And we had this thing about truth. So I said, "You swore to me they weren't hot." And he said, "No, I said I would tell you if they were hot." And he said, "I never said I'd tell you when." And that was a classic story about him. He never was dishonest, but you always had to make sure you asked the right question. And I told that story at his funeral, and his son loved it. And so one day when we were going past the lake, he said, "I want to stop." And we found an old lure on the path to the stream. And we did a ritual around it where I gave him a lure, and I said, "This is a gift," because he said, "This is a gift from my dad. This is my dad showing that he's aware." And I said, "This is a gift from your dad, but let me, but the best gift I ever got from your dad is you." And he said the same thing, and he threw it and said, "Thank you," threw it into the weeds and said, "Thank you, Dad." And again, these rituals arise from the story. They use objects, they're planned and processed. And again, learn from churches, synagogues, mosques, use the primal elements: wind, music, earth, flowers, water, fire. Those all make it. And sometimes you can have collective rituals. In the Dougie Center, which deals with grieving children, At the end of the set of sessions, kids get a medicine bag, little medicine bag filled with stones. Some of them are rough and some of them are polished. And the answer, and the kids name the stones. The rough stones are the things they still have to work on. The smooth stones are what they accomplished in the group. Again, if you're in the school, you're a counselor, you're an advocate, you're an educator. And one of the things I always used to suggest to my counseling students was make sure you have protocols. What happens when a child dies? What happens when a teacher dies? You don't want to reinvent the wheel. And so where do you go from here? Well, ask yourself, do you have a crisis team in place if you're in a school? Are there plans and protocols? Are they comprehensive and adequate? And does it address external and internal crises? And is there a chain of command, and who should be part of the crisis team? And are staff aware? And the last thing I want to say is be prepared. Crises will come in schools. Be proactive, be ready to respond. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Doka. We have several questions in the Q&A. I am going to...
And I don't want to apologize for the phone. I thought I cut it off, but I didn't cut the right wire.
That's okay. I'm going to start with our first question. What do you feel is the best model of grief for a new therapist to study?
They're not incompatible. I would say two. I would say Bill Warden's tasks of grief are well accepted, and the dual process model, which fits in very, very well with that, are well accepted. Again, they both provide, they both sort of allow the grieving process to be seen as kind of open and highly individualized. And I think they're both helpful therapeutically, and they validate that movement.
Thank you. The next question, grief is something we go through. How do we as therapists minimize the likelihood of subjective countertransference besides practicing boundaries?
Well, I think practicing boundaries is too, I use the term reflective self-awareness, that you're constantly in dialogue with yourself. You know, why did that bother me so much? What's going on here? There's a very, very fine book by Renee Katz, and I just can't think of the name of it. But it's, I remember the name of it. It's Renee Katz and somebody else, When Professionals Cry. And that, you know, that can be a presentation in and of itself. But it really is an excellent book that talks about how to deal effectively with that subjective countertransference.
Thank you. Next question. Any recommendations for good self-help books for teens?
Oof. You know, I really don't know that. I'm going to pass on that one because I really don't know the literature of that. I can recommend some good self-help books for therapists. One of which would be, again, When Professionals Cry, but I'm not sure of anything that's really written for teens. There are some good books for teens, such as When Parents Die, and again, if they call Centering Corporation or Compassionate Book Service, they might, Compassionate Book Service, they might find some resources there. There's certainly fine resources on grief in adolescence. But I'm not aware of anything that really addresses self-help and self-care in adolescence. Certainly if there's not one out there, certainly be a good thing to get one.
Okay. Next question. In terms of intake, some suggest the grieving individual to wait half a year or 1 year to join a support group. What is your advice?
Again, that's why I think we have an intake process. I think we need to be very, very individual with that. I think if you meet with a person in intake and you can make an assessment as to how soon it should be, I would probably say as a general rule, 6 to 8 weeks would be my absolute minimum. But I've made exceptions with that when I felt the person could really could really participate in a group process in a healthy way. So right. Again, it's hard to make rules for grief because it is such an individualized process, and so I would go with intake on that. And again, I'd be very cautious 6 to 8 weeks, as a kind of where I would tend to draw my line in the sand. But I don't know that I've always held to that either. Because you're also dealing with other issues too, is, what's available in the community, what resources are, what are the person's needs. So, a lot of factors to factor in.
Thank you. Last question we have here is, what books do you recommend for someone whose partner has died? There are so many out there. Thank you.
Oh, well, I have a new book that's out called Grief is a Journey, which is good. Then I think Therese Rando has a very good book, How to Go On Living When Someone You Love Dies. Catherine Sanders has an excellent book. I forget the title of it, but it's not. I think it might be. I'm not really sure, but again, she has a good book. But I think those would be three that are really quite generic, and those would be three that I'd off the thing recommend. Now, again, it would also depend to me as to whether you have special issues. So, for instance, if someone is really struggling spiritually, A Grief Observed might be a very good book. There are a number of them out there.
Okay, and we had another question pop up. How do you, actually, Ken, I'm going to ask you to advance the slide so that the evaluation code is up. Can you
Okay.
just leave that up while you answer this question so that people
Sure.
can.
So my evaluation depends on my answer to this question.
No, it doesn't. So here's the question. How do you address community grief? For instance, someone that passed away due to police brutality.
I obviously didn't address it in this presentation, but I have addressed it in a couple of other situations, not quite in that context. I wrote a book, and I can't always remember the title here, on public tragedy, living with grief in public tragedy, which addresses those kinds of issues. And certainly there's, and in our newest book now, which is living with grief during COVID-19, there's a wonderful chapter by Rosenblatt and Wallace about systemic racism and its impact on grief and loss. And they have another book called African American Grief, which addresses those issues. So yes, they are being addressed. Obviously, I didn't address them in this presentation. That would be a presentation in and of itself. But I'd recommend, particularly Rosenblatt and Wallace's work.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Doka, we really appreciate your presentation. We are almost to the hour. If you can advance to the next slide, it will give people the schedule that is upcoming. We're going to be having a breakout session. And Dr. Doka, you're welcome to join the breakout session on the grief sensitivity. In case people have additional questions, they may want to talk to you about that. Hold on, we had one more question pop up in the.
Okay, and I'll have to pass on that since I'm going to be on my way to St. Louis for a presentation tomorrow.
Okay, do you have time for one more question?
Of course I do.
Okay, how to deal with anticipatory grief?
Let's define it. Anticipatory grief is one of those sort of strange terms that's been kind of redefined over time. And initially it meant that people who's, let's say you're somebody is ill and they're terminal, and you start grieving as in anticipation of their death. What we realize now, and the assumption was that by doing that it would be easier later on. That didn't turn out to be the case in research. So what we do instead now is we use the term, we understand anticipatory grief somewhat differently. And this is the work of Therese Rando, if you want to read some of her work on that. That's Rando. And she talks about it as you grieve all the losses that are experienced in the course of an illness, each separately. I remember one friend who died of ALS, and his wife said to me, even worse than Kurt's death was when he lost the power of speech. So, so in the course of an illness, what I consider to be anticipatory grief is not so much the anticipation of the death, but all the losses that arise in the contents of the illness, including the loss of a future.
All right, well, we'd like to thank you again, Dr. Doka, and we encourage everyone who is in the session to join us for the breakout room. And we'd like to wish everyone a good day and stay with us. We have lots more coming. And please take a moment to stretch, take care of yourself, and get something to hydrate with.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.